Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen for everybody. Okay, so I'll start here. So as we have talked about so far in the class, what we have been talking about is called stage theories. And this is the idea or the belief that um, uh, development occurs in phases dependent upon the child's age or the human being's age, we should say, and the different cognitive and social and biological abilities that individual has during that time period. Okay. And as we will see when we're going through development, there are what we call ultimate zones of development. So, for example, early childhood is the best time to develop language. We will see that, for example, if a child isn't exposed to different sounds of different languages by the age of about 3 or 4, they can't hear that sound. They physically can't hear it. Okay. And this is why a lot of books, if you have to live especially in a multi cultural type of setting, it's important to expose young children to all of the sounds that are available to them. A good example of this is when I was in early childhood, I wasn't exposed to any type of Spanish language. And now my wife, who is Mexican American, speaks Spanish. And there's literally things that she says. And while she's saying it, I can't hear something that it sounds so you'll be talking and all of a sudden then you'll hear that. So there's these little breaks where I don't hear anything. And what it is I literally can't hear those sounds because I wasn't exposed to that language at that early age. Okay. So my point being is there are times we're seeing that are for ultimate development. But stage theories don't really capture the what we call the ecological effects of development or the environmental effects. So yeah, there may be these periods where we're best at developing something, but it has to do larger with the environment. So what we're going to look at is some what are called ecological models. Really quick to wrap up our section on theories, and the first one of the more early and pronounced ones. This is done. I don't know if his name's on here, but this is presented by Vygotsky, and he proposed two types of ideas, and one is the zone of proximal development, and then the next one is called scaffolding. And if you are going into early childhood education, if you're going into elementary education, you'll study this model quite a bit. Because what Vygotsky argued is that we all come with things that we're capable of doing. So an infant, for example, is able to express their hunger or their needs through crying and cooing. Okay. That's their ability right at that moment. But they don't necessarily have the ability, for example, to feed themselves, to change themselves, and those things. That's dependent on what's called the zone of proximal development, that there is a support system that is around the infant that then provides for those other developmental needs. And then as the child develops to be able to have the motor control to feed themselves and do those and have bowel movement control, then that zone of proximity gets further and further away. Okay. And so these are all what you would call the potentials of the child. And then these are the things that the child just absolutely can't do at a given period of time or a given period of where they're at because they're not being provided with all the necessary things within this potentiality of development. Okay. Now, how does, though, a child widen their zone of proximal development? How do they widen their abilities to do what they can do on their own or can do alone? And this has to do with a notion called scaffolding. Okay. Scaffolding is that gradual learning of something that you just can't, for example, put a pencil in a child's hand and tell them to write their name. Okay. And this is a pretty good example of scaffolding is first you have to get the child to grip the pencil, right? Or the pen. And then you need to have them interact with the paper and see how the pen works and draw maybe nonsense things. And then you have to start getting them closer to being able to do letters. Okay. And that's the next scaffold part of it. So, how to do the A, B, C, D's, and F's. And then doing the phonetic component of writing a name. So getting the association between the sound of their name with the letters that are associated with it. So for example, Curtis, K, C, K, C, and making that association between the sound and the actual letter and writing the letter until you can get them to write their own name. That's the idea behind scaffolding. Now, um, unfortunately, and this is probably probably one of the more difficulty things, especially with parenting and whatnot, that we will see. Hey, how are you? No worries. Welcome. Welcome. Good. We're talking about more ecological models instead of stage models. So I think it'll make sense as we go along now. And so a lot of times, this is the most difficult part of being a parent, is a lot of times we put our adult brain onto children's behavior. So a child acts, out of line or is crying, and you just tell them to knock it off, as if they already have the knowledge of how to knock it off. And it's always kind of funny to watch, how sometimes we don't remember that emotional regulation, behavioral regulation is something that develops. It's not something that we're born with. Okay. And I think part of this, though, has to do with kind of our evolutionary past, because, it's only been about 250 years where we actually have seen children as children. The majority of history, we assume children were born as miniature adults and they were just trying to catch up with their physical body. So it was assumed for centuries, especially in Western culture, that children were born with all of their capacities and their abilities, and therefore they should know how to do emotional control and those kinds of things. And so this has partly to do with kind of that history we have, but partly is that when working with children or even adults, we have to go back to what are they capable of, and then what is their potential, that zone of proximal development, and then scaffolding the learning from there. Okay. And again, if you're going into education and early childhood education, you'll see this model quite a bit. So if you are in those fields, it'd be worthy of taking a look at it. Okay. And then our second model is what's called the Bronfenbrenner. I never can say his name right. Bronfenbrenner developmental series. People can say it better than I can, but what he proposed is really what we consider a real, what's called ecological systems theory. Okay. And what he kind of argued is that environmental systems influence human development throughout life, one, and the emphasis is about the interplay between the individual and their surrounding environment. Okay. So he's going to argue that we all have potentialities, just like Vygotsky, but it's going to be the environment and what the environment demands on us that determines our development. Okay. And again, if you think about it, this kind of goes back to a stage theory when we talked about Piaget and how different environments put different cognitive demands on individuals for them to be successful within that environment or that culture. Okay. And so this is kind of what it is arguing. And he argued that there are different components of development that influence a child or an adult's development. So the microsystem is our immediate surroundings. So we can think of things like school, family, friends, peers. And that really is going to have a large influence on the person that we feel we can affiliate with. Okay, the kind of the in group, who is my people, as you would say. Okay, and then the mesosystem is the interconnection between the microsystems, in between the microsystems. So it's the parents and teachers relationship with a child. It would be an example would be your coworkers and their relationship with your supervisor. Those are all those interconnected components of that relationship. It would be another example of mesosystem is your parents' relationship with your grandparents, or your parents' relationship with your siblings, and those other interconnected that kind of keep us connected together. And then we have the exosystem. So if we're talking for, this is anything external setting that is indirectly affecting an individual. And the best example of this is parental workplace, okay, and for a child. It affects the child indirectly because it provides resources, right, and homes and all that kind of stuff, but it may not have a immediate impact on the child, okay. And indeed, we can kind of see this in research done on the relationship between parents and work and children and work as they become adults, is we find that there's a direct impact of the way a parent carries out their work and how a child will. So I always think of my mom because she was you know, very, very hardworking, and she instilled that into me and my brothers. And as my wife would say, she says, we're all workaholics because we're constantly working and working and working. And is that something that we want to be doing? Probably not, but that's what we've learned to do. Okay. And so those are kind of some examples of indirect impacts. Okay. The macro system is the broad culture and societal influences. So these are laws and norms and the like. And then the chrono system is changes over time. So this is the transitions we see through life. Okay. Now, in practice, what this does is it highlights the importance of the environments in education and caregiving, and guides intervention for child and family services, focusing on context-specific challenges, and informs policymakers for developmental support programs. Okay, so this model is very much, again, a direct educational model that we can see that can be used in education systems to understand what's best for a child in a classroom, in a childcare setting. What are the systems that need to be in place for them to fully develop within, again, their cultural context? So again, if you're in the early childhood areas or the education areas, this is another model that you'll see quite a bit. Okay. The other non-stage model comes from Kurt Fisher, and it's called the dynamic skills theory. And Fisher's idea is that he can explain development as a dynamic and contextual dependent process, which skills emerge through the interaction of individuals capable and environmental support. So what he's really going to argue is that our cognitive and social development really has to do with our interactions with other people, our interactions with our environment, what we're learning from them. Hence, it's the skill theory. Again, when we go back to Freud, and we talked about, you know, what he considered with the Oedipus complex and whatnot, but we talked about the importance of play and the importance of both male and female role models. And I mentioned in that context that we have found that when a child is denied an opposite sex role model or an opposite sex to the parent, they tend to have difficulties in social relationships later in life because, according to Kurt Fisher's theory, they weren't given that contextual ability to develop those socialized skills on how to talk to, for example, the opposite sex, or how to have those skills. Okay, so he argued, when we look at the main components of his theory, he says we look at skill levels and we progress through these levels. And if you look at these, they kind of look very familiar to Piaget's kind of ideas, but he's talking about skills is that we first have reflexive skills. So that's the ability to reach out and grab a bottle and control muscle movement. And then we have sensory motor. So this is physical interactions. And then we have symbolic representation, and then eventually more complex reasoning. And what Fisher argues is that at each of these different levels, we need a different type of learning environment, kind of like the scaffolding in the other model, Vygotsky's model that I mentioned earlier. And indeed, Fisher's going to use the term zone of potential development, much like Vygotsky did. The reason why this isn't a stage theory is that we don't go through a reflex stage, then a sensory motor stage, and then a representation stage equally based on our cognitive, emotional, and social development. Okay. If, for example, on the emotional level, and we look at emotional regulation, we might be in a reflexive period of time because we don't have the environmental support to say how to control your emotions and understand your emotions. So that individual may not develop emotional regulation until later in life, where they may get their cognitive abilities down. They might get to be able to do the writing, the math, and all of those things because they maybe had that support and that environmental contingency. So this is why it's not kind of that stage model that we saw with Piaget. Again, when we look at practice, we can look at education helps tailor teaching strategies to students based on their developmental state. Child development guides caregiver providing right support and therapeutic interventions for different cognitive and emotional issues that children have. There's a saying in the early childhood education field. It's called DAP. It's developmentally appropriate practices, and it's a movement within ECE and early childhood and childcare that kind of encourages the teacher to meet the child at where they are developmentally instead of where we think they should be at the age of 2, 5, 6, and so on, that stages would argue. That instead we meet them where they are, surround them, going back to this zone of potential development, to provide them the scaffolding and the support to get them to have a better developmental experience. Okay, so that's, again, this is another model, and a lot of these ecological models are things that come out of kind of the education field and are used to kind of guide educators on at least a theoretical level. Okay. All right. So that's theories. And those were kind of some examples. I am going to stop sharing. I'm not going to necessarily stop the recording, but does anybody have any questions about the theories? Again, it was just an overview, but does anybody have any questions about Piaget, Freud, Erickson, these ecological models we just looked at, Do you have any questions in the class? No questions? All right. Any questions on Zoom? You could put them in the chat. You can unmute yourself. You can raise your hand. Thanks, Vincent. All right. Well, hearing none, I want to get into, thank you, Chastity. I want to start getting into infancy and infant development. And start working through early childhood because it's kind of very dense in content. So I'm going to go ahead now. We're going to transition and get into early infancy. And in each of these areas, in each of these ages, what we will do is we'll start with physical development, go through physical development, and then we will go through cognitive development and then socio-emotional development. So we're hitting all three of these areas. Along the way, we will make connections between the three areas of development. So what we're going to start with today is physical development within infancy into toddler years, okay? So, and we should always start with the brain, especially given the content of our class. We do use some of the myths that have been proposed is that we only use 10% of our brain. I got good news for you all. We use 100% of our brain. Our brain is active, it's going, it's on 24/7. But there are some unique things. I'm not sure if this is. Okay, we will talk about these. All right. And that they're really, when we talk about the mind-body problem, and whether the mind and the body are two separate things, one thing we should note is that the brain and the body are one and the same. They continually communicate with each other. The brain is kind of the executive of the body. Without the brain, we don't have the body, okay? So as the brain develops, the body's capabilities expand, okay? And as I mentioned, human beings are one of the species with the longest developmental period of any species, mainly because we're born with an physically underdeveloped brain, okay? In fact, our brains can't get any larger than they are now because of, unless something evolutionarily happened with the female pelvis, okay? Because our brains, as we're born with, are the largest size they can get in order to come out of mom's womb, okay? So at this point, unless there's some evolutionary change to the female pelvis area, we're at the size that we can. However, what has happened with human beings is that the brain continues to grow after we're born, okay? And this is vastly unique among other species. We don't find very many other species that are born with a physically underdeveloped brain, okay? And so again, as our brain continues to physically grow, our capacities grow with it, okay? So those are some things to kind of keep in mind, especially when we're talking about these early childhood years, because the physical growth of the brain largely occurs between about the age of 0 and 6. It doesn't fully grow until it's estimated to around about 22, 26 years of age, okay? So we have a long developmental period where we have to rely on caregivers and support as our brain physically develops.
Dr. Peterson?
Yes.
Back on that other side, I was just curious, because I've definitely heard that 10% of the brain thing. Where exactly does that come from, or why is that a thing?
Well, there's actually a couple explanations, and because no one actually really knows, but early research on the brain before we had our fancy screen MRIs and CAT scans. We have under our cortex, we have what's called gray matter. And it wasn't until we actually had good imaging processes that we understood what that gray matter actually does, because it was hard to see activity in it. And so one of the ideas of the 10% is it was assumed that we didn't access the gray matter in our brain, that we didn't have the ability to use that area. But as technology advances, we find that that gray matter is actually very, very active. The other kind of theory is again, we're born with only about 10% mass of our brain. And so that idea that we're only using 10% was this idea, well, if our brain is born with only 10% capacity, then no matter how much it grows, we'll always just be using that 10%. Okay. So those are the two theories. Does that make sense in any way?
Yeah, definitely. And I just something that curious. I don't hear it too often, but when I was younger, that was something that was said. But it makes sense, because of how much time has evolved as well. That of course only our technology would evolve to be able to see things that are deeper and expand on the knowledge of it. So definitely, thank you.
Awesome. And thank you. And I will say I'm going to get to a slides here in a couple minutes. Some of the technologies that we have to investigate infancy. It used to be thought that infants were kind of these blank shells, that they were just learning things with and experiencing the world and trying to learn how to experience the world. But babies are complex little dudes. We'll find they have math abilities that we lost. They have perceptual abilities we'll never have again. And so we'll get more into how technology has actually advanced our understanding. But when you look at a little infant, don't think that they're just kind of there trying to experience and absorb the world. No, they're analyzing, and they're analyzing better than most adults do. So just a little cliff note on our conversation here, especially about technology. Okay. So I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's something you probably did an intro to psych or a biology class. But I just want to talk about the basic structures we have in our brain and just to kind of reflect on our brain's amazing capacities. The cells that make up our brain are neurons, and neurons basically connect with each other through synapses. And it is what's called a chemical electrical activity. So the way our cells communicate, and again, this is just going to be a really quick series, is you have one cell here, and then you have another cell. Our cells actually don't touch with each other, but then a neurochemical is released in this gap. And if enough is received in this one, it sends a message to this cell body, and then an electrical impulse is sent down the nerve to then the next cell. And that's basically how our brain communicates. And if you want to think about it, at birth, we already have 100 billion nerve cells. Okay. Now, I want to just kind of emphasize this point because we're in the era of AI. We're in the era of supercomputers and all of those things. We have not been able to develop a supercomputer that has the actual potential ability of one human brain. Okay. In fact, it's only been in recent years that if we combined all the computers and shoved them in the state of Montana, that we'd have the same processing power with computers. Okay. And if you do that kind of thought project, it really is amazing what this 2.5 ounce or whatever grams is sitting in the top of our head. It's really an amazing machine if you really think about it, and it even does even the best supercomputers. And so that's one thing to consider when we're looking at neurons. Okay. And I do want to make this point while we're here too. You'll notice right here, this cell right here, it has these little nodes on it. Okay. This is called myelin, and it's a myelin sheath, and they're little nodes that go over the top of a lot of cells. Okay. We're born with a mainly unmyelinated brain. We have myelinated cells through our periphery, because what myelin does is, one, it protects the cells, but its main function is to speed up the transmission of a nerve impulse. So we definitely have them in our periphery because we want our brain to talk with our legs really quickly. But in our brain, we're born with pretty much a very unmyelinated brain. Okay. Now, probably some of the most fascinating research that came out of, starting in 2009 and really was ramping up in around 2014, 2015, is we've started, based on brain research, to change our perception about adolescence. Okay. Because a certain period during puberty, our brain in a very short period of time goes from largely unmyelinated to almost fully myelinated. Okay. So if you want to imagine, this is like you're driving a car and it can only go 25 miles per hour. And then just almost in the blink of an eye, it can go 3,000 miles an hour. Now, the reason behind that is because decisions we make as an adults are different than decisions we need to make as children. But as children, they learn better than we do. And that's because they have a slower brain. So they can process that information more deeply and thoughtfully. That's why they can learn language better. That's why they can accelerate in learning how to write and walk and do all of those things. But if you put them in the middle of a street and a car's coming at them at 50 miles per hour, they'll probably just stand there and try to figure out what they're supposed to do. Okay. But that's not how adult worlds work. If we see a child, we automatically react. We go take the child away from in front of the car and take care of the child. Because as adults, we need to make instant decisions. We can't afford that kind of slower processing brain. We probably wouldn't have survived very long. We would have gotten eaten by tigers long ago. Okay, but back to our example when we get to adolescence is it's kind of changed our ideas behind adolescence, in that we find that if an adolescent does get in trouble after they've gone through puberty, and you say, why did you do that? And they go, I don't know. They're actually probably telling you the truth. Because if you think about it, their brain is going so much faster than what their cognition is, that sometimes they do things that are very impulsive because their brain is going so much faster than they are. Okay. And so what we also have found that, children who have hard adolescence versus children who have easy adolescence. Hard adolescence, they get into drugs and bad habits and all of those kinds of things. They usually had parents who said, well, until you figure it out, you're grounded, you idiot, or something like that. They instantly just go to punishment because they think the adolescent should know why they did what they did. But we have found that adolescents who have an easy adolescence have parents who go, well, mom, I don't know why I did what I did. And instead of the mom having a visceral reaction and punishing the child, the mom sits down and goes, okay, well, let's break it down. Okay. Let's start from the beginning. So you walked in the room and you thought, da, da, da. And the parent walks the adolescent through it and relives it with the adolescent until the adolescent goes, oh, that's okay. Yeah, that was a pretty stupid thing to do, or whatever it may be. And so we find that those adolescents with that parent and peer interactions, they tend to have what we call an easier adolescence. They tend to go through adolescence with minor problems, and they are able to have better impulse control than the ones that are not. So, but anyways, I'm just bringing this up because of when we're talking about early childhood, we're going to be talking about a slower brain. And then as we get into adolescence and adulthood, we're going to be talking about more of an impulsive brain. And it's due to this development of myelin. Okay. Now, we should say that synapses, the connection between cells, largely happens after birth. So this is where we think this is how the brain is learning, is through the synaptic connections that it's making as the infant experiences the world. So, okay. So this is the myelin, as I said. I think I got ahead of myself. And then when we look at the brain development, should be some things that we do note at this point. Is the brain, first of all, we are born with a complete limbic system, okay? And the limbic system is sometimes in the brain stem. So we have the brain stem here, and then we have this limbic system right here. Is that pretty much any species that has a brain has a limbic system, okay? It largely deals with our autonomic processes, making sure that our breathing, eating, drinking, and it deals with our memory system, retaining of memories, body temperature regulation, emotional regulation, or physical emotional responses. That's this limbic system and the brain stem right here. What specializes a species is this higher, more neo part of the brain called the cortex, or the cerebral cortex. It just sets on top of the limbic system. Okay. Now, the cortex develops from the back forward. Okay. So, for example, when we're infants, we're born with, we'll get to it in a minute, it's like 20 to 400 vision. Okay. Basically, it allows us to see about 12 inches in front of us, and that's about the acuity of an infant's visual. But it rapidly develops because that's one of the first areas of the brain that develop. And then the second area will be the auditory and spatial. So this is where we get into the spatial abilities. The next area is going to be the motor and sensory area. And then the last area that's going to develop in humans is the frontal cortex. Okay. That is and let me explain really quick that dependent on a species specialty, as you would say, determines the thickness of the cortex. Okay. So for example, birds, back here is our occipital lobe, which processes visual information. The thickness of the occipital lobe in a bird is much larger than the thickness is in our brains. We don't have the same visual acuity. For mice and rats, their temporal lobe tends to be more developed. For humans, our kind of specialty set within the frontal cortex. This gives our ability to understand things like culture, identity, our relationship with other people, logic, problem solving, all of those skills set in the frontal cortex. But it is also the last area of the brain that develops fully. Hence, we say that it probably fully develops somewhere between about the age of 22 to 26. Okay. And so that also is one of the reasons why humans have such a large developmental period. And we have this unique thing called adolescence and this unique thing called young adulthood and childhood and all these different phases of development, because that's going to be the last area that really develops. Okay. So those are some areas to kind of keep in mind as we talk about development. Okay. We should say that as we age, our ability to fix our brain becomes less and less. Infants have a very, what's called a placid brain, okay? Meaning that, for example, in infancy, if they had to remove one of the hemispheres of the brain, that child won't necessarily become developmentally delayed, because the other hemisphere will take on all of the responsibilities that the right hemisphere was supposed to take. Okay. This is why when a baby is born, you'll notice that the doctor or the nurse pokes them with a little needle. They kind of do these little leg things. They push against the legs. They do things with the eyes. What they're doing is neurological tests, because if you catch those neurological issues really, really, really early in infancy, then they won't necessarily have those neurological issues as they grow. Okay. And so we're born with a very placid brain, and then as we age, that plasticity kind of loses its abilities. And so as adults, if we took out our right hemisphere, we'd have some real issues. But it's not impossible. But we also know that a tremendous amount of symptogenesis occurs. This is where the neurons are making connections with each other. And then as we develop, we go through what's called a pruning process. For those things that we don't use anymore, we lose those neural connections. For those things that we use more, those neural connections are strengthened. So the best example of this is neurogenesis between the age of 0 and 6 allows the average child to learn anywhere between 50 to 60,000 words on average. Okay. But then that neurogenesis for language and words stops, and it starts going through the pruning process. So when we stop using words and whatnot, we lose the ability to use those words. So somewhere between about the age of 6 to adulthood, we go from about 50, 60,000 words to actually a couple thousand words. For me, I think it's in the hundreds, but that's just me. This is also when I mentioned earlier about development of language. If a child isn't exposed to certain sounds in a certain developmental period, they lose that synaptic genesis to actually learn those sounds. Okay. So those are kind of, and this is where it gets to experience expectance versus experience dependent. Is our brain works in two ways. It wants to see what it expects and is predictable, but it is also dependent on experiences in order for us to learn from that experience. Okay. All right. For a minute, let's talk about sensations and perceptions. So if you remember back to a Psych 101 class or something like that, sensation is the receiving of physical stimuli from the exterior world. So light waves hit our eyes and it gives us a perception of color. Sound waves hit our ears and it wiggles little hairs in there, which give us a perception of sound. And it is through those things that allow us to actually interact with the world. Perceptions is our interpretation of those sensations. Okay. The best example of this is you hit your little person's, they're developing, let's say, language, and yellow, they see something yellow, that, well, that yellow really doesn't represent anything to that infant until it's symbolized as the word yellow. Okay. And so that becomes the perception, that's yellow. Okay. Um, and as you can guess, yes, we can mess up with young children when it comes to defining the difference between sensations and perceptions, but we'll get to that later in the class. Okay. Now, one unique thing that develops very rapidly in infancy is something called mirror neurons. Okay. Mirror neurons are this kind of unique thing to, well, so we know that primates have mirror neurons, dolphins and elephants mirror neurons, but it's unique to just a certain number of species. Not all species have these things we call mirror neurons. And what mirror neurons are is when you see someone physically do something, the cells in their brain that are firing start to fire in your brain. So literally, when you are paying attention to something or someone, uh, your brains kind of sync with each other because the neurons that are firing in their head are now firing in your head. This is, if you ever want to watch this, if you're at a movie and you're kind of bored with it, but they have an action scene and the person is maybe in a car, you'll notice that when a person turns left, the audience kind of tilts to the left and the tilt to the right. When we get to relationships, we will talk about something called parity. Okay. Again, if you're a psychology or a person, you probably do this all the time. You sit at a restaurant and you start watching other people. Okay. Well, one thing I would encourage you to do is look at people who are on their first date. Okay. Because if they're going to actually have a second date, they're going to start to do something kind of unique. Is they'll start off with their dinner plates and everything kind of in different locations, how they like it habitually. But by the end of the date, their plates, their cups, their silverware, their leg stances, the way they are carrying their body will start to mirror each other. They will start to sync. If you want to think about it, it's almost like they're syncing with each other. And as one reaches for a glass of water, the other one will instantly. When one grabs some food, the other will grab. And it's kind of cool to watch. And sometimes it's kind of creepy, but it's really cool to watch. And this is due to the mirror neuron system. And we know that infants are born with this, well, pretty much. Okay. And what it's going to allow the infant to do is start to learn very rapidly the importance of social interaction. How do I get my needs met? How do I make it so mom will feed me or change me or take care of me? How do I need to respond to them to make them feel better? Okay. And as I said last week, one of our first languages is emotions. This is why the mirror neuron system allows the infant's brain to experience the emotion of the caregiver the same way that parent is experiencing it. Okay. It's kind of a cool thing. When we get to 24 months of age, we're going to start talking about something called theory of mind. And theory of mind is built off this mirror neuroning system, but theory of mind is when we try to think what that another person is thinking. So someone does something, we instantly start thinking, I wonder what they're thinking about. Okay, that's theory of mind. And we found that it develops around 24 months of age, but we'll get to that as we go. But so this whole sensation system, we're already set up to be social beings because we're already experiencing the physical and emotional states that people are experiencing even in infancy. Now, some things that we're not too good at, again, is vision. Our visual acuity is about 20 to 400 vision. and we're attracted to high contrast, and this includes faces. So first of all, 20 to 400, this is why a lot of biologists and even psychologists and people who study locations of body parts, this is why we think that the female breasts are located where the female breasts are. Because if you measure the length between mom's face and the breast, that's the visual acuity of an infant. So the infant can instantly start to recognize mom's face without it being blurred out. So that's why we think that's why the female breast is located where it is. Okay. The other thing I just mentioned, high contrast. So here we have color, and then we have a kind of a low contrast, and you'll notice you can tell the features very much in this high contrast picture. Okay. So again, this is something that has been learned. A lot of infants' rooms and stuff have a lot of, if you put a lot of color in a room and all these kind of colors, and it's really bright, that's actually confusing your infant. It's not actually a good idea. A better idea is toned colors with lower light that increases the contrast in the features of the surrounding. Okay. And so that's why you'll see a lot of, for example, at child cares, the infant rooms are kept at a kind of a darker lot color. There tends not to be a lot of high tone colors, but there's a lot of contrast and features. And that's why in a lot of high quality child cares, they keep those rooms that way, because it allows the infant to have better perceptual abilities and sensation abilities. So let's end with this today. I just want to go through these other um, 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 sensations. So the first one is hearing. We actually know that hearing actually begins prenatally. They're exposed to mom's voice and heartbeat, and we see that infants show a preference for mother's voice at around 3 days of birth. Okay. And so now I do want to mention, well, no, I'll get to that later on. Smell, we know that an infant will react to mother's smell around 6 days of birth. So that's when that sensation starts to develop. Taste, we see that there's a preference for sweet over salty and sour or bitterness. And that we think that these are preferences that are learned prenatally, because we find that a lot of infants will kind of mimic some of the bitterness or saltiness or what that the mom had. Touch and pain. So this is one area that I kind of feel bad for these little guys, is that contrary to previous beliefs, infants can feel pain. They feel pain just as much as we do. And they feel pain prenatally. Okay. And so when mom says, you don't know how much I suffered giving birth to you, well, guess what? How much suffering your infant went through going through your birthing canal, because they felt as much pain as you did. Okay. And this is one of the current theories about what is called infant amnesia. Okay. One of the current theories of why people can't remember being born or experiencing a lot of the experiences in infancy is because of how painful it was. And the brain has said, you know what, we're not going to relive that. And that's one of the current theories of what's called infant amnesia, the inability to remember actually being born and those experiences at that point. Okay. But I am going to end there for today, since we went through them. And I'm going to stop our recording.